Hello there, ATS EVS 105 students. Dr. John Schrage here, and we're continuing our 8th module of the course. We've been looking at ways that we could be dealing with climate change. We talked about adaptation strategies, and we didn't like them. And we talked about mitigation strategies, and we didn't like them. And we talked about geoengineering strategies, and we didn't like them. Well, tough luck. Now we're out of options, okay? Probably some mix of all those things is going to happen. Certainly adaptation and mitigation, we're not going to be able to do much else about it. So today what I want to talk about is some of the ways in which we can have policies that will encourage mitigation. We talked about the mitigation technologies back in that lecture, things like solar power, hydroelectric, nuclear, biomass, etc. Let's talk about these options here. We had adaptation strategies where we were, just dealing with what comes along, and there were lots of risks there because we don't really know what any of that's going to cost. We talked about geoengineering options. Well, few people really think that this is the right time for that kind of solution. It may come to it, but remember, that's kind of just hiding the problem. And then there were these mitigation strategies, the reduction of greenhouse gases in ways that were going to at least be delaying the onset of the most serious problems and maybe even helping us avoid the very worst problems and so on. None of these mitigation strategies are going to make much of a difference between now and the middle of the 21st century. The truth of the matter is the committed warming of the greenhouse gases we've already put in the atmosphere and so on pretty much means that between now and 2050 or something like that, we're pretty much stuck with the climate change that we have caused. But they could have huge impacts on the climate, for the second half of the 21st century and beyond. And therefore, in the current readings, we're going to be exploring in some detail the policy options that governments can use in order to reduce emissions, which might mitigate climate change. And I'm going to tell you that there's going to be conventional regulations, there's going to be market-based solutions, and there's going to be, of course, information and voluntary methods. Now, we're not going to actually talk too much about information and voluntary methods. I mean, obviously, individuals or companies can choose to do things that mitigate their climate impact, and should, but I mean, there's not a lot we could talk about in a science class about those kinds of voluntary actions. Let's talk instead about the kinds of things that, as a society, we can choose to make happen, like, for example, the conventional regulations. Now, there are a number of different ways this can be done. This is not a policy course where they could talk about all the different kinds of policies and the different kinds of international obligations and so on. But basically what we're talking about here are what are called, in that context, are called command and control regulations. A command and control regulation is where, there's the legislative body or the regulatory agency or whatever simply sets across a regulation that's, requires all emitters in a particular economic sector to meet one particular standard. For example, the government might require that there's a certain minimum mileage that a vehicle can get, or that a certain sector, like passenger cars on average have to get a certain amount of mileage or whatever. Or we could require power companies to use particular technologies, maybe some kind of scrubber that removes black carbon from the smokestack or something like that. Most of these regulations are really clear and easy to understand, and in fact many regulations do use this kind of approach. They seem very fair, they seem very, they don't have a lot of, I don't want to say unintended consequences, because all regulations have unintended consequences, but they're pretty straightforward to plan. But there certainly are a lot of problems with just sort of command and control type regulation of our mitigation of climate change. I mean, if you just specify that there's some technology that you want the power companies to use, or some industry to use, or some particular technology you want automobile makers to implement on their vehicles, the problem is that might not turn out to be the best one. And you'll actually see a little bit more about that in one of the questions I'm going to be asking in just a little bit. Another problem, though, that's a little bit more subtle is a regulation that's going to force all of the emitters to some standard, like all of you must reduce your emissions to this much, or all of you must have this proportional emission, or whatever. It ignores the fact that some emitters can make the change more easily than others. I mean, there are different technologies at different power plants, different technologies at different modes of transportation, and so on. They can't all necessarily make changes equally easily. If you just impose some standard, you're effectively picking the winner, right? Some technology, some industries, some transportation modes, etc., will be able to make those standards more easily than others. Also, regulations and these kind of command and control type regulations in particular don't really provide any incentive for the development of new technologies and future innovations. I mean, if you are requiring that all of your power plants switch to wind power, there's no incentive whatsoever for the power companies to do any kind of research into, say, biomass energy, okay? Because that's not what's going to be used anyway. So this is not necessarily for the best. Command and control regulation is not necessarily the best solution we have at a policy level to make these kind of mitigation strategies work. Now, before we move on with this lecture, I want to ask two quick questions here. Question one. Which of the following would be an example of a conventional regulation that could be used to reduce carbon emissions into the atmosphere? You have three options here. A, requiring all power plants to adopt some new technology to reduce their emissions. B, imposing a tax on emissions. Or C, issuing permits to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Which of those would be an example of a conventional regulation? Make a choice from those three options and get a little feedback before you move on to question two.